1549, the rabbinical court in Cairo held hearings and engaged in extensive research to learn about the source of the annual flooding of the Nile River. The rabbis of the day found themselves on different sides of this scientific question, and they defended their respective positions. But why did they care about this question? That is the subject of today's shiur.
In the year 1549, in Egypt, there was some sort of ceremony, some sort of proceedings that took place in the Beis Din. Presiding over the Beis Din in 1549 in Egypt was a Radvaz, known by the name of Reb David ben Zimra. Reb David ben Zimra grew up, or was born at least, in Spain, and he was part of the expulsion of Spain in 1492. And like many Jews, he made his way to the Middle East, and he settled for a very long time. He lived in Mitzrayim. Ultimately, he ended his life in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. So what happens is that in 1549, his court is presiding over proceedings, and there's eidos. There is someone who comes along and who offers testimony. The eidos is as follows. Let's read number 1. Kabalnu eidos mereb Yitzchak al-Chabashi. We received eidos from a man named Yitzchak al-Chabashi. Chavash is the Hebrew word that's used in this time period to describe Ethiopia. Yitzchak al-Chabashi means Reb Yitzchak from Ethiopia. We have other tshuvas from the Radvaz at this time, where he writes about, in his language, he calls them Yehudim Hadarim Be'eretz Kush, the Jews who live in Ethiopia. And he discusses their status. And by the way, this is a very famous tshuva when it comes to talking about the Beta Yisrael community from Ethiopia. So it seems that this Reb Yitzchak al-Chavashi is from this Beta Yisrael community in Ethiopia, and he now is in Egypt, and he's giving eidos. What does he say? V'zeu nuschai, and this is the affidavit reads as follows. B'mois of Tlasa. So here you have the standard language. There's 3 judges. They were sitting, and then etc. Kishabar Reb Yitzchak, and here Reb Yitzchak came, etc. Veheyid, and he gave the following testimony. What did he say? Ich kishabah me'artzai. When did he come from Ethiopia? Haya ben tesvav shana. He was 15 years old when he came from Ethiopia to Egypt. V'haya dar ba'artzai al Nilos. And in Ethiopia he lived at the Nile River. We know the Nile River as being the river of Egypt, but it originates in further south in Africa, and so he lived on the Nile River. V'amar, and he said, Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shatchilas hakshamim ba'artzai. When is the beginning of the rain season in Ethiopia? B'Nisan, in Nisan. Now the reason that's important, and this is noteworthy, is because if you're living in Mitzrayim or in Eretz Yisrael, when is the beginning of the rain season? Cheshvan. And when does it end? In Adar, Nisan is already no more rain anymore. But there it's different, so it's unusual, so that's why it's being noted. The beginning of the rain season is in Nisan, V'chaskam, and the strongest point of the rain is B'tamuz V'av, which again, very different if you were living in Egypt and the land of Israel. Okay. And due to the abundance of rain that falls at that time, all of the people in Ethiopia stay in their cities. They can't go from one city to another city because there are so many streams and rivers, so much water flooding all over the place that you can't travel in Ethiopia during the rainy season. Okay. And he went on to give further testimony and said, "Shatoisefes hanar asher poi Mitzrayim," that the adding, the floodings that happen here in Egypt, where does that come from? So first, what are we referring to? The Nile River. What's unique about the Nilus is what Chazal sometimes call the Nibul shel Nilus, Nibul Malashon Mabul, the flooding of the Nilus. Every year, we'll see more of the timing soon. The Nile would rise. There is no rain in Mitzrayim. The Nile would rise, and it would flood a vast area, and this is how the agricultural life of Egypt was sustainable. And so that's what he's referring to. And he's saying, you want to know where this inundation of the Nile comes from? You should know that this comes from the abundance of rain in Ethiopia. Because in the time when there is no rain in Ethiopia, then the river is very small. But when you have a lot of rain in Ethiopia, the river rises a lot, and it rushes forth toward Egypt. And this is the addition, the adding, the inundation, the flooding that happens to the Nile every single year. This is the source. I should point out that today Egypt doesn't have this anymore, and that's because around 1970 they built a big dam that's called the Aswan Dam, and as a result of that, this doesn't happen. But for most of history, until very recently, this was an annual occurrence in Egypt. So all of this is the eidos that Reb Yitzchak from Ethiopia is giving, and he's one to know. Why is he one to know? Because he comes from Ethiopia. He was there, and he's here, and so he knows, and he's giving eidos about this in Ethiopia. And we got another witness, and this is from a Jew who was born in Egypt, who says he traveled, and here is the language of the affidavit of this eidos, and then it gives the date. When did they receive this second eidos? It was Yom Vav. This is how it appears in the print. Tes Vav Yom L'Chodesh Tishrei, the 15th of Tishrei. That obviously is an error. They're not going to be taking eidos on the first day of Sukkot. But something, whatever, there's some sort of typo over there. Shnas Hey Shin Tes. Hey Shin Tes is year 1549, Poi Mitzrayim. This is one of the tshuvas. Where am I getting this from? One of the tshuvas of the Radvaz, or David Ben Zimra, in volume 8, which is the most recently published volume of his tshuvas. There were the last few decades that were printed, meaning there was tshuvas that the Radvaz printed many centuries ago, but this was printed recently a few decades ago. And you have this Gvias Eidos in one of his tshuvas, you have this affidavit in one of his tshuvas. And I hope this strikes you as odd, because why do you have a court in Egypt in the year 1549 collecting testimony from a traveler and from someone from Ethiopia about exactly where the Nile originates from and how the rain patterns are working and why the flooding is surfacing here? But this is obviously interesting, and we're going to see exactly why this is occurring. The Radvaz in this tshuva goes on to quote additional sources, all on the same thing, trying to figure out what is the science behind this Nile River. So he throws in a line in this tshuva that says as follows: Gam Reb Binyamin Bal Hamasois, also Reb Binyamin, the traveler, Hayid, he also testified, Shenilus Misrabe, that the inundation of the Nile is Mimek Shamim, comes from rainwater. Who is he referring to here? He's referring to, as follows, one of very, very interesting work that's very important for Jewish history. There was a Jew who lived in sometime in the 1100s, and around the year 1165, he went on a big travel to see the world, and he wrote a travelogue. The idea being that this will be interesting for people to read. And indeed, it was a bestseller. This was a very, very popular work. First, in the manuscript age, this was read very widely, and it was printed for the first time in 1543, which is a few years before this whole event occurred. Perhaps even Radvaz had a copy of the printed edition. If not, then he had a copy of a manuscript. Who's this person? His name was Binyamin, and he was from Tudela. Tudela today is a city in Spain. It's a region in Spain. It's in a region called Navarre. Sometimes it was part of Spain, sometimes it wasn't part of Spain. Anyway, there was a Jewish community there. He grew up over there, and sometime in the 1100s, around the year 1165, he goes on this huge travel. He goes to many, many different places. And it's very interesting to learn and to read what he writes about the different Jewish communities around the world. So let's see. Radvaz is telling us, read that travelogue to see what he says about the Nile. Why? Because he showed up in Egypt. Let's read what he wrote. This is from one of the printings of this work in 1907. So it says as follows: The Yaor is Yoitze Pam Achas B'Shana B'Chodesh Elul. The Nile rises once a year in the month of Elul. This is actually not so exact. We know from other sources, the Radvaz himself, who tells us that in fact the rising of the Nile would begin in Tammuz, and it would till Tishrei, and then after Tishrei it would go down. Okay, but Elul is right in the middle at that period of time. Umechasa kol haaretz, it covers the whole land. Umashkois hamahalach tesvav yoiv, and it provides the water necessary for agriculture 15 days distance. V'amayin nisharim, the water remains on the surface Elul v'Tishrei al pnei haaretz la'ashkois u'la ravoisa. That is true. We, as I mentioned before, Advaz tells us that this period ended in Tishrei Cheshvan. It started going down. And this sustains the agricultural. If you own a field, he's describing workers. You're going to make a nice big ditch in your field. And then the fish, because the water is there, the fish enter these cavities. When the water starts pulling back, the fish remain. And the field owners take these and they consume the fish and they sell it. In other words, he's just giving you one of the descriptions of one of the physical benefits of having the floodings of the Nile. Now, Rabbi Yamin continues and says, and everyone asks, why does the Nile rise? And the people in Egypt say, he's like, I don't know, but I can tell you what they say. That up there, the Eretz al-Chavash, that's the same term in Ethiopia, and he's calling it up there. Why is he referring to up there? Ethiopia is a very, very high altitude, very high, one of the highest on earth. Egypt is very low, relatively speaking. So therefore, it's Lamaila. So Lamaila be'eretz al-Chavash. In Ethiopia, Yoyrid matar harbe bizman alois hayar, there's a lot of rainfall, while at the same time that the Nile is rising, umirubam, and due to that water, hu oila hayar, and that is why the Nile rises. And so therefore, not only do we have two witnesses from today in the 16th century saying this, Radva says, I have a source from the 1100s who tells us that this is what was widely believed at the time. Okay, the Radva says this is not enough. I'm going to bring you more sources to prove where the rising of the Nile is coming from. Number 4, Oy Sha'alti, he says, as Pi Chachameyam, they're the sages. When he says it means the non-Jewish scientists. V'cholam eskimu, and all of them agreed. Shumei Rov Kshamim. You want to know why we have this yearly rise of the Nile? It's because of the rain. Okay, so I asked the scientists, but he went further. Oy badakti b'sifreim. I checked up their books on my own. V'chasu b'asvarim, and in their books it says, Sibas gidulayhu, the reason for the rise is mehak shamim, from rain, oy afsharas shlagim, or from the melting of snow. Oy kasu b'sifreim. I also saw in the secular books that it says as follows, Shemixas hamalachim arishonim, that some of the earlier kings, sholchu shlichim, sent messengers, ladas ma'inyan anar, to find out what is the Nile, and where does it originate from? Ve'idu lahem, and the answer came back, sheyotza mahar echad, hanikra, Jabal al, it says Qatar, but it needs to be Kamar. Jabal al-Kamar. Jabal means the moon, Jabal al-Kamar. Jabal al-Kamar, Jabal means a mountain, and al-Kamar means the moon. So the mountain of the moon. The Hainu Har Halavana. So it comes out of what's known as the moon mountain. And it continues to flow, the river does, because of the abundance of rain. This is a reference to, we know what this is. This is a reference to one of the philosophers, scientists who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. His name was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy has a work that survives to this day. And he writes over there that he heard that there is in Ethiopia, there's this mountain range. And it's called the Moon Mountain. The reason it's called moon because it's white, snow-capped. And so therefore, snow-capped looks like the moon. And so, and there's abundance of rain. And that's where the Nile originates from, and because of the rain, the abundance of rain that happens in a unique time of the year, that's why the Nile rises every single year. So that
the moon and high tide, like exactly what we think.
No discussion about the tides, and the tides aren't going to really play a role in this. We'll circle back to that. So what do you have here? So the Radvaz is collecting testimony in his day. He's giving you Reb Binyamin the traveler. Now we see he's going to the scientists of his day, and he's making his own investigation in the scientific works that were available to him at that time. One more source where we see the Radvaz is going ahead to do this. Another source of testimony is Harav Even Ezra. We're going to go to the biblical commentator, Avraham Even Ezra, that's Hanogid Kvoid Harav Nosin Shaloel Zal. Also, the Nogid. The Nogid, a moment on this, in Mitzrayim, like in times of the Rambam, and for multiple centuries thereafter, there was an official position that was called the Nogid. And the Nogid was the person who was the leader of the Jewish community. He represented the Jews to the secular, to the non-Jewish authorities, to the, at the time was Islamic authorities, and this was a very prestigious and important position. And so there was one, a Nagid called Nasin Shalol Zal, and he was Mechaber Pirush HaTorah, Kara Shema, he called his commentary Keser Torah, and he, Nasin does, quotes in the name of Even Ezra the following. In other words, we don't have this quote from Even Ezra. We don't have the Sefer Keser Torah because it didn't survive to this day, at least as far as I know, it didn't survive. But Radvaz quotes for us one passage. What does he say over here? I'll summarize what he says in this passage outside. He says as follows. There is the account in Sefer Bereshis where it talks about the 4 rivers that originate in Gan Eden. And one of those rivers is known as Pishon. And there's a discussion, and there are some sources that say, and Rashi al Torah actually says that Pishon is the Nilus. Says Nasin Shalom, the name of Even Ezra, I don't think it's the Nilus. Pishon and the Nilus are 2 separate things that are not connected with each other. Why? He says, the 4 rivers, that's in Gan Eden. In Gan Eden, he says, where's the physical location of Gan Eden? That's at the equator, where the time of day and the night is equal. It's 12 hours all year. That's the area where you have to look for Gan Eden. You need to look over there. Whereas the Nilus it originates way south from the equator. And here he says, because where does the Nilus start? He says, there are mountains that are called Har Halavana, that are called Moon Mountains, and they're in Ethiopia. And that, he says, it's south of the equator. And the reason the Nile floods every year is because of the extra rain, the abundance of rain that happens in the summer during those months in Ethiopia at that time, and that is why the Nilus rises, and so therefore the Nilus is one thing, Nahar Pishon is another thing, and the 2 things are 2 separate things. The bottom line is, for Radvaz, looking at this, what do you have? You have Even Ezra, and you have Nasan Shaloel quoting the Even Ezra, basically saying the origins of the flooding of the Nile comes from rain every single summer. And the question that I asked before is all the more pronounced right now. Why in the world does it matter for a Rav, and for a rabbi, and for a Beis and for a community to figure out what the origins of the Nile River are? So the truth is, there was a debate. There were people who disagreed. Who disagreed? So in the tshuva the Radvaz he brings 2 rabbis. One was named Chacham Avram, and one was named Chacham Yitzchak. And they lived at that time in Mitzrayim, and they said, no, you're wrong, Radvaz. This is not the origin of the flooding of the Nile. It has nothing to do with rain in Ethiopia. That's not where it comes from. Why? Well, they brought rayas. So first, let's look at the rayas. The pasuk says in Dvarim Perek Yud Aleph, it says as follows: when you're coming to Eretz Yisrael, it's not like Mitzrayim, because in Mitzrayim you didn't have rain, whereas in Eretz Yisrael, you will drink water from rain. The land of Israel drinks water from rain. Now, if the Radvaz is right, that the flooding of the Nile happens from what? Happens from rainwater. So then is there really a difference between Egypt and Israel? It's kind of the same. This is rain and that's rain. So this is evidence, they say, that no, the flooding of the Nile, nothing of the Nile, not the regular Nile and not the flooding of the Nile has anything to do with rain. Now, I ask you, is this the strongest proof in the world? I don't think anyone will say this is the strongest proof in the world. In fact, you could say no. The answer is, on a very practical level, you can respond and say, yes, Egypt's flooding of the Nile comes from rainwater in Ethiopia, but in Egypt there is no rain. In Egypt you don't experience any rain. At the end of the day, where do you get the water from to water the field? It comes from the Nile. It doesn't come from heaven. So there's an easy way to get out of this, but this is one of the pieces of evidence that they brought. Then they brought a medrash. The medrash says as follows: in the beginning of creation, in Sefer Bereshis, the pasuk says there was no rain yet. There was the beginning. I don't remember the lashon pasuk, but it says there was no rain yet. And so the medrash says as follows: Keitzad horas hoisa shoisa. So in the beginning, when there was no rain, how did the fields operate? How did we have water? So there's different shittas, but they quoted Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kadei Nilus. So it's similar to the Nilus. Now what happened? That the Nilus, there is no rain, and nonetheless it rises and waters all the fields. And so too, before there was rain in the beginning of time, rather than having rain, you had the water, the seas, the oceans, the lakes, the rivers would rise, and that would water everything. And then God changed the system, that instead of it coming from below, from flooding, instead it would come from above, it would come from rain. So they said, look over here, you see that it used to be the system was coming up from the bottom, and now the system changed in a way where there was rain. Now in the beginning of time, there was no rain. It's very clear that there was no rain. And still it's saying, so what was the model then? The model then was no rain and the rising of the bodies of water. So and it's saying that that's what the Nilus is. And so therefore we should look at the Nilus today and say it's the rising of the Nilus without any rain. Okay, is this a compelling argument? I think if you thought for a few minutes, you could also come with a way of saying that it's not a persuasive argument. Indeed, Radvaz does that in his Tshuva. But I want to just show you what their argument was. Next, they gave another argument. This is more like a philosophical argument. Look what they read. Here's Radvaz quoting their argument. Here they have a problem. Theological problem. If Radvaz is right, that the reason the flooding of the Nile happens is because of the rain that happens further south in Ethiopia. So it turns out that Egypt's economy is really dependent on what happens in Ethiopia. But then, in Kilkulu Masayim, what happens if the Ethiopians are no good, and Hashem decides that he wants to bring a drought into Ethiopia? That's not fair. To Kupach Parnasasam Shel Yoshem Mitzrayim, that's going to mean that the people in Egypt are going to suffer. And so therefore, that makes no sense, Radvaz. Rather, it makes more sense to look at the source of the flooding of the Nile independently within Egypt rather than in another country. Okay, is this a compelling argument? Radvaz says he doesn't understand this argument. What type of... He says, you think God can't figure it out? God can't do it this way. He can come up with another 100 ways of figuring. He can give too much. He says he can give too much rain over there. There it would be bad. Here it would be good. Or he could bring something else. The whole conversation is a little bit of a non-starter, the Radvaz says. Okay, v'oid. They brought another argument. What's the other argument that they brought? These people living in Egypt, they saw the rising of the Nile every single year. Every single year. They also know that rain is inconsistent, right? What do we know? Especially when you read sources from Eretz Yisrael about rain, one of the major takeaways about rain, especially from source in Eretz Yisrael, is this is very inconsistent. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, we don't know, on and off. Here, they're growing up in Egypt, and they see every single year the Nile rising. Rain to them is not that consistent. So they said, you're telling me the Ethiopians never had a drought? Because this Nile rises every single year. Okay, so the Radvaz in his Chuvas, he responds and says, check your history books. There actually have been times the Nile didn't rise. And why didn't it rise? Because there was a drought in Ethiopia. Okay, but you see the discussion that's happening here. Then, here's the last point, the last raya that we're going to bring that they said at that time. I'm talking about Reb Avram and Reb Yitzchak. The two, additionally, same time. The Shoiklin Titanar, the Egyptians have this ritual, this procedure, where they take some of the mud that lies at the riverbed, Balayla Yadua, on a certain night, Hanikra, which is known as Leil Hanukta. Leil Hanukta. This is a certain night, I wasn't able to figure out exactly what this is, where they would take this mud, and then there was some sort of procedure observing how much additional weight ended up in this dirt that night. Yala Nilus Shana, and that was a portend for what would happen to the Nilus the coming year. I don't know exactly what they were doing here, but they were doing some sort of testing on the soil, on the mud of the Nile, and based on that, it's like Groundhog Day, similar to the concept of Groundhog Day. It's going to tell you how long the winter is going to be. So this was the Egyptian ancient way of doing their Groundhog Day, where they would take this mud and this would tell them how much flooding is going to happen now. Would mud in the Nile know about rain in Ethiopia? No, he doesn't have that information. Would he know if the information is embedded within the Nile? Oh, yeah, maybe that makes sense then. They don't have that information. So therefore, this is a raya that the flooding of the Nile originates here, in the location where this mud is sitting. That's where it comes from. It comes from the source, which is right here, by its very nature, in this mud. And not from rain. What was their model? Their model essentially said that whatever underground source you have for the Nile, that is also the springs that you have, underground springs and underground water aqueducts. That is the answer for the Nile, and that is the answer for the flooding of the Nile. It's right here, and that's why the dirt that's positioned on it somehow has in its DNA, it has the answers to those types of questions. So Radvaz obviously was not impressed by this argument, and he said, I'm not obligated to believe this, and every year, many years they get it wrong, and it's not a good test bichlal, and so therefore to bring this into the courtroom to figure out right from wrong, this is not going to be acceptable. Okay, So now we have the Radvaz pushing in one direction. We have Rabbi Avraham and Yitzchak pushing. There's a whole big debate in the Jewish community in 1549 in Egypt about what is the source of the flooding of the Nile. And the question is, what is the difference? Who cares what is the source of the Nile? So the answer is as follows. Here we need to learn a little bit about the dinim of mikvahs. You have the pasuk says in Parsha Shmini, Ach mayon ubar mikveh mayim. These are the words that the Torah uses in Parsha Shmini, and it's telling a yiyah tar, and Chazal learned that pasuk to mean that a mayon can make something tar, and also a bar mikveh mayim. What's a mayon? A mayon is a spring. That's water coming from an underground source, an underground aqueduct, where water is flowing, and this is called a mayon. This is immersion can happen in a mayon, and something could go from tumah to tara in a mayon. That's one way. What's the second way? A bar, a pit, mikveh, gathering of mayim, a pit of gathering of water. This also is a way of yiyah tar, where we can create tara. What's the difference between the two? So Chazal taught us, and here we'll learn it summarized in the Rambam. Ma bein mayim lemikveh. What's the difference between a mayim and a mikveh? Ha mikveh ina metar ela beish boira. A mikveh only is effective to make things tar be'esh boiron when the water is stagnant. Why? That's what mikveh means. Mikveh means you gathered water. So if the water is flowing, then it's not gathered. That's the very definition of a mikveh, is gatheredness. To the contrary, and on the other hand, what is the definition of a mayon? Definition of a mayon is that it's flowing water. That's how it flowed forward from the underground source to where it is right now. So because the very definition of the mayon is flowing, so therefore it's kosher as a flowing thing. V'hamayon mitar b'zoichalim. A mayon is kosher if it's flowing. A mikveh has to be stagnant. Okay. So therefore, this makes a difference between a situation. If water is flowing, it depends. Are you a mayon? It's okay if you're flowing. If you're a mikveh, you're not okay if it's flowing. So now, take a typical river. If you take the typical river, and let's assume that this river comes from an underground source, and the river is flowing, no problem. It's a mayon, it's going to be kosher. What complicates things, however, is what happens if it's a mix. What happens if it's a mix? Why? Because if you have a river and it's also raining, so on the one hand, it's a gathering of rainwater, then it needs to be still. On the other hand, there is a river here and it has some underground source, so it's a mayon. So how are we supposed to navigate if something is a mix of both? So that brings us to the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Samachay on the base, where it says as follows. The Amar Rav, the Amoira Rav said as follows. Mitra b'marava, the rain that occurs in the west. Remember, Rav is living where? In Iraq. Iraq does not get a lot of rainfall. The average rainfall, even today in Iraq, is considerably less than the rainfall in Eretz Yisrael, and definitely less than the rainfall in Syria. And so, the Mitra b'marava, the rain that happens west, which is much more than happens by us, Sadar Rabba, the great evidence for that rain, because we don't have that rain, we don't see the rain here because it's not raining by us. But the great evidence that rain is occurring further west in Syria and Eretz Yisrael, Paras, the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River, why? When we're able to see that the Euphrates River is growing, why is it growing? Why is it getting bigger? Why is it rushing quicker? All of these things are happening because of the rain that we don't see here. That's happening further west in Syria and in Eretz Yisrael. Why is Rav saying this? Why is Rav having this scientific discussion about the source of a river? Savar, so the Gemara explains, Rashi tells us the word savar here means he was worried about the fact. He took into consideration for halachic purposes that what? Shaloi yirbu hanoitfin al hazoichlin. The issue was that Rav was concerned that maybe you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have more noitfin. Noitfin means the droplets of rain. You're going to have more droplets of rain coming from above. Al hazoichlin, on the naturally flowing spring water. In other words, you're going to have more rainwater than you have spring water. Now, what's the answer to our question? The answer to our question is what happens to a mix of both. According to Rav, the answer is you go by the majority. And Rav was very worried that there's an issue here that although he's living in Baghdad or in the area over there and there is no rainfall over there, so you say everything's good. No. You see the river is growing here. Why is the river growing here? Because there's rain over there, and so therefore we need to be choshish that there's more rainwater than the spring water. And because there's more rainwater than the spring water, then you're not allowed to toivel in it while it's flowing. Rashi explains, Nisan, when we're in the Nisan season, Shanahar is Gedalim, where the rivers grow, Mimei Hakshamim Shayamei Achayra, from the winter rains, Umei Avshara Shlagim, and from the melting of the snow. Chayish, Rav is worried, Shema Yirbu Anoit Fanal Zaychalim, that maybe you're going to have more rainwater than you're going to have spring water. Ve'ein toiras mayan alein, and then it doesn't count as a mayon litar bezoichelin, and you can't go into this mikvah while it's moving. You have to somehow figure out how to get it to go still. And this is why Rav was talking about his situation. His river is growing, the rain that's happening further west. Okay, this is Rav Shita. Rav Shita is very clear. You're seeing a river that's growing. If there's reason to believe it comes from rain, you go from rain, and then you need to worry that it could be there's more rain than flowing water, and then you're not allowed to use it as a mikveh if it's flowing. However, Rav was not the final word on the subject. You had another Amoiro, Fliga de Shmuel. Have Shmuel come along and say, nope, disagree, not worried whatsoever. I'm not worried whatsoever. The Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, Nahara, you want to know where the river's source is? Mikife mivrach. Mivrach means it expands. The growth of the river comes from the rocks, meaning the rocks, the underground source. Don't tell me rain. I don't care if rain here, rain there, rain anywhere. You want to know where the river is growing from its source. And therefore, it's a mayon, because it's coming from the underground. And therefore, it's rushing. I don't care. You can use the mikvah. So in other words, Shmuel and Rav have a very serious disagreement here. Now, Tosfos says, I have a very big problem with Shmuel. What does that mean? It comes from the rocks. We see very clearly, any person with eyes sees that it's raining, and then you see the river expands. Any person who is observing what happens sees that. So how is Shmuel going to address that? Shmuel will say, no, I ignore the fact that it's rain, it's coming from underground. How do you deal with that? We see clearly that it comes from the rain, Tosfos says. So what's the answer? We have to modify or explain Shmuel's shita. Because we have a teaching not said by Shmuel, said by someone else. In Mesechus Tainus, what does he say? That when it rains from above, if it rains one tefach of water, guess what? There's a response from below. There's a response from below, and where there's more output from the underwater springs. Whether that's because water, when it rains, also ends up in these subterranean aqueducts, and once it's there, it counts as underground water and then comes up. That would be one way of explaining it, or maybe there's another way of explaining. I don't know. But the bottom line is, Tosfos says that this is the meaning of Shmuel. Shmuel says, I know it's raining, but I don't care, because you're never going to be in a situation where you're going to have roiv. Why are you never going to be in a situation where you have roiv? Because the roiv is always going to be spring water, because for every tefach that's coming from above, you're getting two tefachim from below, and so therefore it's always a mayan and it's always kosher. Okay, now we understand Shmuel, and then continues Tosfos and says a very interesting statement. He says, this is the shit of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says, the hilchas hakavasei de Shmuel. This is a big chiddush. Usually, we say in Dinei Mamonos, the halacha is like Shmuel, and in Yonim of Isurim, including what's a kosher mikveh or not, the halacha is going to be like Rab. Rabbeinu Tam here drops a major chiddush that the halacha here is like Shmuel. That's why we, Jews living in the 1100s in France, we rely on this litpo ben haros afilu in gadlumoid, even if they expanded very, very significantly. And even though it's raining, and so we see that it's due to the rain, and so it's flowing. Hey, you can't use it. It's not a minus, make shaman. Nonetheless, we say, yeah, for however much rain, you got more that's coming from below, and so therefore it's a kosher mikveh. This is a very big chiddush Rabbeinu Tam. Number one, to pascha like Shmuel, and number two, to speak about the fact that we kind of, or number one, to pascha like Shmuel, and Shmuel itself is a big chiddush, so to speak, to kind of ignore the rain and to postulate that you have this response from the water underground. It's a very big deal. So you have some poskim who came along and said, well, Rabbeinu Tam is only talking about what we call, they come and they're mitzamsim the heter. What's mitzamsim the heter mean? They'll come along and they'll say, this is if you don't know. If you don't know, then we rely on this. But if you are pretty confident that there's more rainwater that came above than over the natural water that's here in the riverbed, then you're not going to rely on this heter. So you have amongst Rishonim who already did this. Okay, but at the end of the day, all that's Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam is not the last word. Rabbeinu Tam told you the halacha is like Shmuel. Well, guess what? Let's look at the Rambam says. The Rambam says in Hilchos Mikvos, if you have more rainwater coming from above over the natural river, then einon mitarim bezoichalin. it's not allowed to flow. It doesn't work if it's flowing. Ella be'eshboira, and it has to be made to stand still. Therefore, what do you need to do? You need to bring in some sort of mats and some sort of boards. You have to basically create some sort of corner in this river, in that mixed river, until you find a spot where the water is still, and then it works. So what happened here? Rambam discusses the issue of Rav and Shmuel, and very clearly he's passing it like Rav. Because he doesn't tell you, oh no, it's always good, you never have a problem. No, he says you do have a problem. And what does it go? It goes by majority. You estimate, if there's more rainwater than the natural spring water, then this is not kosher as a mayon anymore. So now we could understand, with this background, let's come back to Egypt in 1549, and we could understand why rabbis and sages are discussing what the origin of the flooding of the Nile is. So let's read in the words of the Radvaz, number 16. The Radvaz says, Sha'asarti, I forbade litbol to go to mikveh bikalij. Kalij is an Arabic word, and it means a canal, right? Because the Nile is flooding, so you have the regular path of the Nile, and then you had all these little offshoots that were dug, that were created, that would become little channel ways for water to go very, very, very distant from the actual Nile. These were called kalij. And these were very accessible to people. And people say, you know what, I can go to mikveh right here. And they were probably next to people's homes as well. I could go to mikveh right here in one of these canals, or one of these kalijes. What is a kalij? He defines for us. There's no water there all year. However, when the river expands, the water goes in there. And it's not only there's water there, they're rushing. The water is rushing significantly. So you're not allowed to toivel there. And I also said, even in the actual Nile itself, any area where the water is growing and expanding, why? Because he holds that it's rainwater. All this is rainwater. And so therefore, kalij, it's all rainwater. Rainwater cannot be moving, and it is moving. The Nilus, this whole area where it expanded to, that also is all rainwater. You can't toivel over there. So I answered it. And by the way, another big point is, we're going to see soon, and it was never done, he's going to argue. It was never done in Egypt that women use this for the mikveh. It didn't happen. Now, in our day, there's been a new breach in the standards. The toivel is b'chol makom b'kalij, and now they're using this mikveh in any place in the kalij. And in fact, the Beis Din got edus of a case just to show that, by the way, the water is flowing. Because you can say, what's the big deal? Maybe they're doing it in a way where they're doing like the Rambam said, and they're getting the water to be still. No. Because they received testimony about a case, she'echad, I guess there was a man who was there, whose tafas as ishtay b'sairo, had to hold on to his wife by her hair, kedei shelo yichu hamayim, that the water shouldn't take her away. Why? Because it's a significant rush of water, and so this is happening. And so this, he says, is a major problem. Now, if you say, let's go back to the Gemara. If you say that Shmuel is right, then you don't have a problem. If you say Shmuel is right, you don't have a problem. One sec. Let's see why. So let's read number 17. If you want to follow the psak of Shmuel, muter litbol b'kalij, then you're allowed to toivel there. Why? Because what did Shmuel say? Shmuel said that for every much rain that's happening, you have more of an output from the underwater. So what is this kalij water? It's underground water. Underground water is kosher when it's flowing. Sharei din mayin yeshloi, as a din of a mayin u'mitar b'zaychlin, and so it's good when it's flowing. So what's the problem? Just rely on Rabbeinu Tam. Who says to paskin like Shmuel? No, doesn't work. We do not rely on this Rabbeinu Tam because the majority of the poskim that we care about, remember he's in the Sfar tradition, the poskim, and he gives a long list of poskim. Mamish, a very long list of numerous names. No one thinks that you follow Rabbeinu Tam, because no one thinks that you follow Shmuel, because halacha is like Rav when it comes to Yisurim. We saw the Rambam a moment ago ruling like Rav, Ela Karav. Why? Because they basically, without accepting Shmuel's position, they're accepting what's observable. And what's observable is that this added water comes from where? Comes from rain. If it comes from rain, then the second it's more rainwater than it is Mayan water, then you're not allowed to toivel in it when it's flowing. Okay? And that's generally. And that's why it was important to find out what's the deal with the Nilus. Where is this flow coming from? And that's why I did the scientific work, and that's why I did the investigation, and that's why we did the Gvias Eidus. I wanted to find out. You have the discussion in general about all rivers of the world. That's Rav and Shmuel having that general discussion. But I want to actually know what's with the Nilus itself. Do we have information of the Nilus itself of where is this expansion coming from? Because we don't have rain here. Because if you had rain, then you say, oh, rain, follow Rav. Because you see the rain. So it makes more sense to follow Rav, and Shmuel's view is a little harder when there's rain. Like, we see this rainwater, but we're not going to count it as rainwater because we're going to say that there's something else. But in Egypt, there is no rain. So in Egypt, there is no rain. Maybe that would tilt you a little bit in the direction to say, okay, maybe it's Taka Shmuel, maybe it's all underground, maybe that's all that's happening over here. No, so I did the investigation, and I found out that no, it also comes from rain. Narvaden, it comes from rain that's many, many, many miles to the south, but it doesn't change the fact that it's rain. And so therefore he says, Ein lismay chalav, don't rely on Rabbeinu Tam. Besides for all the arguments, he then introduces the following, the Asrei da Rambam Zal. We are in the location, in the place of the Rambam. This is very interesting. He's writing in the mid-1500s. The Rambam passed away in the beginning of the 1200s. So we're dealing with 300 years later, but he's still saying, this is the Rambam Shtat. We can't just come here and just decide how we want to do things. And he wrote what we saw before, that we paskin like Rav, who has the gall to walk in to the Rambam Shtat, even 300 years later, and to say the Rambam was Machmer, but we're going to be Mekel, and you're dealing with the Isser Karis. Isser Nida is an Isser Karis, which means a very, very serious Isser, and so therefore, this is off the table. Now again, I mentioned a moment ago, I'll mention again, you could always speculate that with the Nile is different. Maybe the Nile, you go more in the direction of saying it's all coming from underground. Why? Because again, we don't observe any rain. So even if for other rivers you're going to say, oh, if I observe the rain, I'm following Rav, makes no sense to say that there's a response from underground, right? So you hear that, but in Egypt you may not go that direction. You may go in the other direction to say, I see no rain, so let me suggest that this river is different and it's coming from underground. And they wanted to say that. And he says, no, but clearly we see the Rambam didn't hold that way. Why? Because the Rambam wrote his book in Mitzrayim. He wrote Mishnah Torah in Mitzrayim. And if he believed the Nilus were different, he should have said something. Who kasav chibure b'Mitzrayim? Ve'im isa shenilus yoytze mechlal ha'naharis. If you want to say that the Nilus is an exception to the rule, u'mikifei mivrach, and it expands from the underground source, hayoloi loymar. He should have said so. Meteloi pirish, and because he didn't say so, mashma de'ein chiluk. Really, that teaches us that according to the Rambam, there is no difference. Therefore, what's the bottom line according to the Razvaz? Ulefi shitazu, it is very clear. Hadavar barer she'ein litpo bikalish klal. There is no toiveling in these canals. V'loi benilus atma. You're not allowed to toivel in the Nilus either because it's full of rainwater that is taking over and it's the roiv, and so you can't do it. Zulas. Those 3 months. What are the 3 months that you're allowed to? Next, number 21. Of Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, those are the 3 months when the Nile is at its lowest point, where there's no added water in the Nile, and that's when it's flowing, but that's fine, because that we consider a Mayon, and so therefore you can go into the Nile River during those months, and it could do a mikveh, not a problem. However, from Tammuz time, which is when the rains in Ethiopia started. Now, for about 4 months, the river starts expanding. Tammuz of Elul Tishrei. Then and then the remaining 5 months of the year, it starts going down, but during those months you can't use it either, because when are you going to know when it's more rainwater or less rainwater? Don't get involved in Sveikus, and you should not be using the mikvah during that time. Except if you do a tikkun that we'll talk about in a second. Look at number 23. Hilkoch, if you want to be clear, what you do is you need to figure out how to make the water settle. So you can put up walls, you can put up some sort of barrier, Or you can create some sort of like offshoot of a pit where the water is going to go into there. And the bottom line is, if you manage to do that and the water is still, then you're good to go and you can use it as a mikveh. But if the water is flowing, you cannot use it as a mikveh, except during those 3 months when we know for sure it has a din of a mayon, then you're good to go. While he was talking about this, he also mentioned another chash that he has. This is in number 22. The two, additionally, I just want to point out another problem, a separate problem. Kivin shanar amuk v'nimshach b'shatav gadol, because the river is flowing and it's deep and flowing intensely. Afilu tamed al hamadrega, even if she stands on some sort of step or platform. V'tachnis reishel l'seich hamayim, and bends her head in order to tovel. After shelo yolichu hamayim, the water is going to drag her and take her away. Okay. V'ani badakti ze ba'atzmi, I in fact checked this myself. V'ani tovel b'makim zeh. The Radvaz says that he goes to mikveh in this place. I don't know if he means that he's done it multiple times. Why did he do it? It's not a kosher mikveh. So okay, is it because he was a man, or is it that he just did? Maybe it wasn't for mamish ritual purpose. Maybe it was. Maybe he just did it once. Maybe he just did it, but it's the lashon here is interesting. Anyway, I'm telling you, I saw the water carries you away. So what's the problem? Those women who don't know how to swim, how could you toivel in a mikveh in a place where it's dangerous? You're going to have to hold something. Holding something gets into a whole bunch of shilas about chatzitza. And so therefore there's another reason why he doesn't like the flowing water. He just thinks this is not a good idea, even though in a mayom, which is kosher, that's fine. Whatever, you deal with it. But he's like, I'm adding this on as a second reason why don't toivel there. And if you're going to toivel there, do it in a way where you're making the water settle. So now we understand what was going on over here. The other people, they basically wanted to say like this. Don't say, follow Rabbeinu Tam. You follow Rabbeinu Tam, we basically say no matter how much rainwater, you always have more output from below. Even if you don't want to follow Rabbeinu Tam, well, the Nilus is different. The Nilus is different because there is no rain over here. Let's therefore, and we have all those sources and evidence that seems to imply it's coming from the aqueducts that are underground right here, and so therefore let's just assume that this is different. It's not coming from rainwater, and therefore you should be able to toivel in this situation. They tried justifying what the Radvaz called a new minhag that he thought was wrong-headed, and that therefore he sought to come and correct. Okay, so that's the topic. That's the subject. Let's now link it to this week's parsha. This week's parsha we learn about Bas Parai. Learn about Bas Parai. What does it say about Bas Parai? Bas Parai lerchatz al hayor. By the way, the Sefer, the Torah and Sefer Shmois does not give her a name. Does not give her a name. However, in Divrei Hayamim, there is a pasuk that says that there was a Parai, and there was a daughter to this Parai whose name was Bisya. Bisya. That's the nikud on the word over there. Bisya. Chazal say that she is the same person as Bas Parai in Shemos. Well, if that's the case, some people have wondered. It would seem when we're younger, we talk about Basya, the daughter of Parai. And in fact, Basya is a very common Jewish name. We don't hear Bisya. It's very common to refer to Bas Parai as Basya. Is that a mistake? Are we basically mispronouncing the name? Chazal tell us to link the two. There, it says Bisya. So what's interesting is as follows. It's not the topic, but just a small parenthesis. There's a discussion about gittin, where you need to get the names right in a get. And the Shemach Tzedek has 4 tshuvas about the name Basya. 4 different tshuvas about the name Basya. Basically, the issue there is as follows. The Alter Rebbe did not like the idea of writing, there were women whose name was Basya. The Alter Rebbe did not want that in their gittin it should say Beis Taf Yud Hey. Why? The Alter Rebbe reasoned that when you see that name is Bisya. That's what you have in the Torah. In Divrei Hayamim, it says Bisya. So that name is Bisya, but their name is Basya. And so therefore, the get's name is not the same as their name. And the Alter Rebbe was concerned about this. The Alter Rebbe went further and said on one of the occasions that it could be that the name Basya, the Jewish women had in his day, in the 1700s to 1800s, didn't even come from the Bisya name. It could be it came from the name Basheva. And it was some abbreviation of saying Basha. Some people called Basha, some people called Basya, but these were all abbreviations of Basha. And that made the problem even worse, because her name has nothing to do with the Bisya in the Torah. And so the get, the Bisya in Divrei Hayamim, the get says Beis Saf Yud Hey, and her name is something else. And therefore, Alter Rebbe was very concerned about this. What did Alter Rebbe suggest? That her get should say Basha, Beis Shin Aleph. this is a big chiddush, even though all her life, everyone always called her Basia, but Alter Rebbe felt that this is the best solution for this problem. Okay, the Tzemach Tzedek came along and said, we don't have to worry about it. He said that he has a tradition that Alter Rebbe later changed his view and said that it's not necessary to do this, and it is okay to use the name to write it in the get, to write the name Basia in the get for someone named Basia. Why? Tzemach Tzedek said it's very simple. When a woman's name is Basia, she signs her name all the time. There are documents all the time. There's all these ksubas all the time, and it always says Beis Saf Yud Hey. So that's just the name. Today it doesn't mean Bisya anymore. It means Basia, and so therefore that's what it means. And so therefore it's okay, and the get reflects the person's name 100%. You don't need to worry about it. But then the Tzemach Tzedek goes further and says, in fact, I'll tell you even more than that. When you look at the name in Divrei Hayomim, it says Bisya. We, however, when we read Chumash, we say, and we teach the kids, we say Basia. So here we learn, they're ready in the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, we say Basia. Huh?
No, Basia is modern Hebrew.
Basia, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter. We say Basia. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, why are we doing that? Is it wrong? Tzemach Tzedek says it's not wrong. Why is it not wrong? Because there's a medrash. The medrash says, why is she called Basia? What's the meaning of the name, right? Some names in Lashon HaKodesh, they mean something. Why is she called Bisya? Says she's called Bisya because it's Malashon Bas Yudke, the daughter of Yudke. Says the Tzemach Tzedek. So what was the meaning of her name? Her meaning, I know it, legally is Bisya, but the real neshama of her name is Baska. That's what Chazal tell us. So therefore that is her name. Her real name is that. And he goes, the only reason why they didn't call her that Mamish is because in Mitzrayim it's inappropriate to call someone by the daughter of God. You're in a land of idolatry. And so therefore her name was Bisya, but really her name was Basia, which is why we use that name and we call her Basia, which is why both Alter Rebbe is concerned that the name in Divrei Hayomim and the name Basia is two different names. No, it's actually one and the same. And so therefore, it's not a problem. Anyway, that's a little bit of a parenthesis on the name. Okay, so back to this week's parsha. It says, Ateidet Bas Parai, which now we'll call Basia, Lirchayt Ala Yor. Zakti Gemara and Saita, she went down. This is when she finds the Moshe Rabbeinu in the Nile. Sheyarda Lirchayt Migelule Avia. Why is she going Lirchayt Ala Yor? That's a little bit of an interesting thing. I'm sure she had a beautiful merchatz in the palace. So why did she come to the Yor? She came because she went to wash from the disgusting Avodah Zarah of Pharaoh. Zok Rashi, to clarify, what does that mean? Litpel Sham L'Shem Geirus. She used the Nile as a mikveh. Okay, alarm bell should go off in your head. Use the Nile as a mikveh. Is it a kasher mikveh? It's flowing. Is it the Radvaz and Reb Avram and all those issues? You don't have to worry about it. Why don't you have to worry about it? Because look what the Gemara in Saita says, Vaiter. Amar Reb Chanina bar Papa Amar. Reb Chanina bar Papa said, when was the day that Moshe was discovered, which is the day that Basia went down to the river? Was the 21st of Nisan. Amru Malachei Hasharatz Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu said the Malachim said, Rebbeinu Shalom, Misha Asid Loimar Shira Al Hayam B'Yom Zeh. In a few years, when there's Yetzias from Mitzrayim, there's going to be Oz Yashir that's going to be said by Moshe Rabbeinu, which is said on Shvi Shal Pesach Chaf Aleph Nisan. He's gonna suffer on this day. He's gonna be taken from us on this day. Save him right away, and that's why Bas Parai comes. So this is that shita. Another shita says, it was the 6th of Sivan. The Malachim came and they said, he who's going to receive the Torah, that person is going to be persecuted, suffer, whatever it is, on this day, he has to be saved, and so therefore he's saved. The second shita makes more sense from Pshuta Shamikra, because the Torah, we have a tradition that he was born on Zion Adar. We don't want to mess with that. Count 3 months from Zion Adar, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. So the second shita works out perfectly well. It happened 3 months after his birth. The first shita is a little more difficult. The way Chazal explain it is that it was an Ibrayar. So therefore you had most of Adar Rishon, you had Adar Sheni, and most of Nisan. It wasn't a full month, but good enough. So the 3 months are full months, and that's the cheshbon of how it works. Either way, the earliest it is Nisan, the latest is Sivan. What are the Radvaz's 3 good months? Nisan, Iyar, and Sivan. The Radvaz's good months are Nisan, Iyar, and Sivan. So no problem. She avoided the whole Shaila Lechatchila. Okay. Now let's conclude as follows. In this tshuva that Radvaz, it's 3 tshuvas. In volume 8, It's Simin Kuf Lametes, Simin Kuf Mem, and Simin Kuf Mem Aleph. It goes on for long. There's a lot of arguments back and forth. I'm giving just a small synopsis of a much larger discussion. And there's a lot of subtopics that are very interesting that come up. I want to do one little thing. And that is, there was a discussion is, well, is it the minig? Is it the minig to toivel in these kalishes? Because if there is, so then we know a minig is sacrosanct. So let's look what Radva said on that. 2 quotes on that subject. Zeh minig asher amarta. This minig that you're talking about, Avram and Yitzchak, Reb Avram, these 2 chachamim that said this is the minig, ain't I klom, it's nothing. Mikam upon him. For numerous reasons, this is not a minig. Chada, number 1, shaloi hukva al piva sikin. This is not made by pious people. This is not made by people who are of a high spiritual standing. Ela minig ba'alma, it's just regular people. The efshar shu minig betos, and when regular people do a minig, and it's not endorsed by the rabbis, and it's not made by tzaddikim, it's possible that it's a mistake, and that's what this is. If it's a minig that people started doing, why? Because there's no evidence of any rabbinic sanction or endorsement to this. The 2, moreover, I want to say another thing. Dani godalti bein hanegidim uvizmanam. I grew up during the period of the negidim and in their time. What's he saying here? I mentioned before that in Egypt you had this special office. The Rambam occupied it in his day, the Rambam's son in his day, and it stayed in the family for a few generations of the Nugget. This is the prominent person who represents the government. Very often, usually, maybe, but at least very often, they were Talmidei Chachamim as well, authors, whatever it is. It's not the same as it is. Reish Galusa, it's a similar concept. Reish Galusa was in Babylonia. This is in Mitzrayim. Now, what happened was that the government in Egypt changed. In 1517, there was an invasion of Egypt, and that's when the Ottomans took control. We know the Ottomans had control of Egypt for a while. That started in 1517 when they took it from the Mamluks or something like that. So now, like this. When they took over, they were mevatel the whole office. The Negidim weren't there anymore. He's writing now, this is 1549, 1550. So he's looking back and saying, I'm here, I gedenk the gute Zeiten before the Ottoman invasion. Now we're 30 years into it. I remember before the Ottoman invasion when we still had the office of Negidim, and you could sense here him saying, that's when Egyptian jury was good. That's when it was right. That's when things were working well, before the Milchama, right? How often do you hear that? That's what's happening. Before the Milchama, before the invasion. And v'lo shamat, and I was there. V'lo shamati minig zaklal. I did not hear this minig. In other words, it didn't exist. It's a new thing. Ela efshar sha'ata just started. Nagu mixas nashim, and he calls them atzlanios and bilti tznois. He calls them lazy and he calls them immodest. The ain's a minig lismech olav klal, and this is not something to rely on. So he's denying the fact that this is a real minig. Then he says in number 28 as follows. Even if this was an ancient minig. For example, you would say that this happened and the Chachamim saw and didn't say anything. Nonetheless, I would come and I will be mavatalit. And don't tell me, oh yeah, but how could you if other rabbis let it happen? And here he quotes a Gemara in Chulin, interesting Gemara. The Gemara says that Chizkiah, okay, there's a pasuk that has Chizkiah coming along and getting rid of idols. Frek the Gemara, there were righteous kings before him. There was Asa, there was Yehoshaphat. They didn't get rid of these idols before. So the Gemara says, Makom hinichuli, that Chizkiah's attitude was, Makom hinichuli avayso, my fathers, my righteous fathers, they left something for me to do too. In other words, and so he says, and the Gemara says about Rebbe said the same thing, just because in an earlier generation they didn't make a macha, doesn't mean that's the last word. They left the space for me to come in my generation and for me to make a seder over here. The Eloi Tema Hachi, if you don't say, and then he adds, and by the way, the Esher, maybe they didn't pay attention. Maybe they didn't know this whole thing that there's actually rain in Ethiopia. And he goes and says, if you're not going to say this, then basically no one can ever make a chiddush, because you're always going to say, if it's true, why didn't the other guy who came before you say it? But that's wrong. Completion, perfection, that's only with God. And so we don't look back and say, oh, but that great rabbi didn't say anything, and so therefore it must be, this is right. These are just small 2 pieces of a much larger discussion about how do you know if it's a minig, is it a valid minig, when are you allowed to be mavatal a minig, and likewise there are many discussions that happen here as well. And to just conclude with an idea from Chassidus on the subject, what's the difference between mikvah and mayon? Both are water. Water represents Torah. So a mikvah is Torah and a mayon is Torah. Well, there's 2 attitudes, there's 2 ways of learning Torah. Mikvah is separate from its source. The source is the clouds, the rain above, and when you're going into a mikvah, it's separated from that. A mayon, by definition, every part of the water is connected to a previous part of water that is connected all the way back to the original spring. So a spring represents connection, and mikvah represents separation. Again, both are in Torah. There's two ways of learning Torah. One in a way of connection that Rebbe explains in the Sikha, I believe it's Yud Tes Kislev or Yud Shvat Toshin Yud Aleph. One way of learning Torah is in a way of connection, and one way of learning Torah is a way of separation. What does it mean to learn Torah in a way of connection? That's when I'm learning, and before I learn, and after I learn, and even while I'm learning, I sense that as much as it's interesting, as much as it's fascinating, as much as it's stimulating, and as much as it's an academic pursuit, at the end of the day, I'm connecting with Hashem. And so therefore that's a mayon, because you have the water, you have Torah, but it's connected to its source. Mikvah, it's also nice, it's also a good thing, learning Torah. However, it's in a posture, it's where a person's in a posture where it's forgetting about the source. This is where the experience itself is interesting, it's stimulating, it's fascinating, but the idea that I'm connected to the Noisanat Torah, the one who gave the Torah, that's something that we don't have. So what do we want to try to achieve? We want to try to achieve that we should have a mayon, that we should, rather than having a mikvah. Both are fine, but a mayon is considerably better than a mikvah. We want to have that our Torah study should be in such a way we're actually able to sense the feeling that we connect with Hashem when we're engaged in it.